My first ever exposure to Miss Marple was the 1986 TV adaptation of The Murder at the Vicarage starring Joan Hickson. And it was almost my last, as I was so bored and confused that it nearly turned me off of Miss Marple completely. When I started reading the novels, I put off reading this one for years and years, until for the sake of completion I finally gave it a chance. And I effing loved it. It is far and away my favorite Miss Marple novel. Not my favorite Miss Marple book, but favorite novel. So, what was so wrong with the adaptation? Was it flawed, or was I just an easily bored 12-year-old? The 2004 adaptation starring Geraldine McEwen was decent, despite a fair amount of changes. The only alteration that was really iffy was a series of flashbacks in which Miss Marple is having an affair with a married man, and she breaks it off just before he goes off to war. It doesn't seem in character for Miss Marple, but I'm not too bothered by it. So, let's dive into the comparisons. The book takes place in Miss Marple's home village of St. Mary Mead, and is narrated, appropriately, by the vicar, Leonard Clement. He lives with his much younger wife, Griselda, his ghoulish nephew, Dennis, and the vicarage housekeeper, Mary. Clement is fed up with his overbearing churchwarden, Colonel Prothero, who believes someone's embezzling church funds after a parishioner's donation goes missing. Prothero is disliked by everyone, including his daughter Lettice, who it's believed is having an affair with Lawrence Redding, an artist. Miss Marple rightly suspects that Lawrence's affair is with someone else, Anne Prothero, the colonel's wife, as Clement discovers when he walks in on them. Other characters include Hawes, a curate, Archer, Mary's boyfriend, who's in trouble for poaching, Dr. Stone, an archaeologist excavating a burrow on the Prothero's property, his secretary, Miss Cram, and a mysterious newcomer to the village, Mrs. Lestrange. Just before his meeting with the colonel, Clement is lured away from the vicarage with a ruse. He returns to find a pale, shocked-looking Lawrence just leaving, and enters to find Prothero dead, shot through the head. Both films retain the book's plot pretty accurately. It's the characters that go through major alterations, or deletions. 1986 leaves out Dennis, Dr. Stone, and Miss Cram, and many of the characters that remain are tragically understated. Lawrence Redding has so little screen time that it's easy to forget who he is, despite his importance to the story. Lettice Prothero in the book was basically a prototype for Luna Lovegood, vacuous, dispirited, and shallow, but underneath, intelligent and purposeful. You can't tell any of this in 1986. She comes off as just an average, angsty teenager. Her scene with the vicar goes from fun and intriguing to dull and a little uncomfortable. And then there's Griselda. Griselda is the primary source of the book's comic relief, but not because she's the butt of a joke. The dialogue between Clement and Griselda in 1986 is largely word for word from the book, but the way they present it gives us a totally different relationship. Book Clement tells us that Griselda is incurably flawed, and that marrying her was, for her, a lucky mistake on his part. Well, if you were to believe the film, that's as far as their relationship goes, because this Griselda is indeed a disaster on two legs. Book Griselda's response to Clement is that he's the lucky one. She chose him because he couldn't resist her, in spite of her flaws. But the whole point is that they're both lying through their teeth. They're each afraid to acknowledge their true feelings because they adore one another. It terrifies them how deeply in love they are, one because he's afraid she'll leave him for a younger man, and the other because she's afraid he'll reject her for not being good enough. They are layered with a capital L. 2004 might be inventive with its dialogue, but the end result is that the characters that come across to us are, for the most part, book accurate. True, Miss Cram is now Dr. Stone's granddaughter, and they're both French, and Mrs. Lestrange's personality is more like Miss Hartnell's, and Miss Hartnell in turn is more like Miss Weatherby, but still, this film deserves even more credit than I gave it the last time I talked about it. To be clear, Joan Hickson is fantastic as always. Her expressions and her delivery are priceless.
Colonel Prothero has always struck me as being rather a stupid man.
The only problem is we don't get enough of her. Other minor nitpicks. Prothero keeps talking about nailing that curate for the missing money, and it's true, Hawes is the one responsible. But we're not supposed to know that yet. Likewise, they figure out the note by the body is a forgery really quickly. When Inspector Slack first appears in the book, he's established right away as a condescending jerk when he says,
"Room been messed around much, do you reckon, Doctor?"
Nothing's been touched.
he keeps rudely and incorrectly assuming the people around him are stupid and incompetent. Of course, the vicar and the doctor knew well enough not to touch anything. But in the film, Clement touches every freaking thing in the room.
Nothing's been touched.
Yeah, nothing, except for everything. The film turns Archer into a fugitive, and he's actually hiding in the vicarage when the murder takes place. And this I don't mind, given how many suspects they've left out. It's interesting that the book specified Clement can't ride a bicycle, and both films are like, nah. The scene with the two farmers is film only, and I admit it is funny.
Father, Vicar says you'll be on your deathbed.
I'm not. I'm on the asparagus bed.
Anne and Lawrence kick off the investigation by each confessing, and then admitting they confessed because they suspected each other. Thanks to medical evidence and witnesses saying they heard the gunshot at a certain time, both of them have alibis. Any readers who enjoy trying to solve a mystery by careful examination of clues would have plenty to work with here. There's a broken clock and a note by the colonel, both of which seem to have been tampered with, maps of the study, the vicarage, and that section of the village, some bogus phone calls, gunshots heard at different times in different places, Miss Marple's own eyewitness account. Weirdly, for the reread, I probably would have been less confused if I didn't already know the solution. Miss Marple tells Clement that there are 7 suspects. Our attention is drawn particularly to Hawes and Mrs. Lestrange, and there are several hints that Dr. Stone is a fraud before Miss Marple's nephew Raymond comes for a visit and unwittingly reveals the fact. There's also a clue that implicates Griselda, but Clement, in his narration, seems to be oblivious to it. Close to the end, the vicar meets with Miss Marple and gives her all the clues he's collected. At first she's puzzled, but then after her attention is drawn to a plant in his study, she suddenly has an epiphany. Shortly afterward, Clement gets a phone call from Hawes, who says he needs to confess. Clement finds him drugged, having taken an overdose of his medication. The real note that Prothero wrote just before he died is lying beside him, exposing Hawes as the embezzler. It seems Hawes is the murderer, until Miss Marple turns up and says Hawes was set up by the real killer. 1986 continues to alternate between scenes where nothing's happening and scenes where something's happening but it's unclear what. The direction is such that you're not paying attention when people are speaking, so it's easy to miss important story developments. All of the original story's busy comings and goings, all the rumors and theories and creepy anonymous notes, all the energy has been replaced with, well, walking. So much walking, and half-finished sentences and, we assume, meaningful looks and everything else you tend to find in a tense drama, except it's all too vague and confusing for us to feel any tension. I would say Lawrence has been butchered as a character, but they've reduced him so much he barely is a character anymore. In the interrogation scene with Inspector Slack, Lawrence has 0 dialogue.
In the habit of visiting the deceased's wife from time to time?
Some creative effort was made regarding Mrs. Lestrange. In a film where the problem is an overabundance of subtlety, or such was the attempt, the exception is the romance between Mrs. Lestrange and Dr. Haydock, an embellishment of their relationship in the book. Towards the end, Mrs. Lestrange is confronted by Anne, but the confrontation turns into a heart-to-heart. It's actually sweet. Both film versions reveal early that Mrs. Lestrange is Lettuce's mother. That's why Lettuce destroyed a painting of her, to keep the police from discovering who she was. 2004 leaves out Anne finding the slashed painting of Mrs. Lestrange in the attic, and Mrs. Lestrange no longer has a terminal illness, but otherwise this adaptation retains more elements from the book than the previous version. As far as changes and additions go, Miss Marple takes a much more active role in the investigation, even though she was injured by a motorcyclist, and Inspector Slack is, slightly disappointingly, made more human by having to deal with his wife's recent separation from him. Hawes is made to feel even more suspicious than he was in the book, and Dr. Stone, or Dufosse as he's called here, played by Herbert Lom, confesses that he actually went to the vicarage to kill Prothero, but he was already dead. Instead of Prothero's valuables, Dufosse was after proof that the colonel's war profiteering led to the capture, torture, and death of his grandson at the hands of the Nazis. I forgot to mention, both films moved the setting from 1930 to 1950. Oh, we also find out that it was Mrs. Price Ridley who sent Clement the anonymous note about his wife, a mystery that the book leaves unconfirmed. Miss Marple explains how Anne Prothero and Lawrence Redding planned the Colonel's murder and staged their own self-accusations to throw off suspicion. Although it was Anne who pulled the trigger, Miss Marple asserts that Lawrence is the real killer, and Anne is under his thumb. Hawes was meant to be their second victim and scapegoat, but Haydock saves his life. The primary mistake the killers made was that when they reappeared after ostensibly having said goodbye as lovers, they didn't seem upset. The only reason they could have for not wanting to appear upset was that they didn't want to be suspected, and they weren't supposed to have been aware of the murder at that point. The book ends with Slack getting the credit for solving the mystery, and Griselda announcing she's pregnant. 2004 rushes the ending a little, but again, long book, fixed runtime for a TV movie. In the book, the killers faked the gunshot with a timed device using picric acid. In the film, they just used a muffled rifle shot. 1986 also changed how they faked the gunshot, only these killers used a loudspeaker in a birdhouse. But here's the thing. As in the book, the strategy to trap the killers involves making them think that Hawes's landlady can implicate Lawrence. In the film, Lawrence's response is to try to murder the landlady, and the police are there to catch him. Right after this, we see Anne's dead body. She's committed suicide out of remorse. 12-year-old me still didn't know who Anne was, so I thought this was the body of the landlady. I thought the police had used her as bait, and even though the murderer was caught, he'd still killed her. It wasn't until years later, after I read the book, that to my relief I realized my mistake. Regarding the 1986 film just as a film, I can't be too mad at it for failing to entertain a 12-year-old dork, and I can't blame it for having themes that went over my head. If not for the mishandling of certain characters and the wonky direction, it would be just as solid as the other entries in the Hicks and Marple series. As an adaptation, though, it could have been so much better. There's so much of the original story they could easily have included, and that in turn would have made it a better film. Because whatever the style of directing, the audience would have had more with which to stay engaged. There's nothing wrong with a story having a slower pace, but it still needs to have substance, tangible substance. If 2004 had been allowed a longer runtime with the same content, it would have been an, almost, perfect Christie film. So, it's a challenge to keep cranking these videos out once a month. I'm publishing a book series, I'm editing an audiobook, I just finished directing a play, and I'm about to jump right into another one. I've gotten a lot of requests in the comments to cover specific stories, which I really appreciate because that says to me that people like what I'm doing and they want me to keep doing it. I'm not going to give up, it's just going to take me a while to get around to them all, so thank you in advance for your patience. A lot of people have requested that I cover Death on the Nile, which is definitely going to happen. Probably not this year, but it will happen. Although, Agatha Christie wrote more than one story titled Death on the Nile. Thanks for watching.